With the voice referendum fast approaching, it's worth asking, exactly how powerful will the voice entity be? There's a lot of confusion in this area and a lot of mixed messages, coming even from within the Yes campaign. For example, it has been reported that Yes campaign telephone callers who are phoning people to campaign for the voice have been spreading mixed messages. If the person is concerned that the voice will be too powerful and might divide people, then they're being told to downplay the voice's powers and suggest it is more modest and merely advisory. On the other hand, if the person is more of a progressive no that wants a powerful voice and wants treaty and reparations, they've been told that those things are down the track and will be brought about after the voice. We seem to be getting mixed messages from the campaigners. From major leading Yes advocates, we also get some mixed messages. Anthony Albanese has suggested the voice is merely an outstretched hand. It is a symbol of recognition and reconciliation, and is a modest change. Marsha Langton, in a co-authored article, has suggested that the voice is not really that different from other existing lobby groups, although she did seem to gloss over the fact that those lobby groups are often private sector, they are independently privately funded, and they're not constitutionally enshrined, nor do they have any right to make representations. And in any case, she suggested that it isn't that different from what we already have. Kenneth French, who was on the High Court, suggested that Parliament might be able to limit the ambit of the voice. This is because the Parliament can prescribe the manner through which the voice makes its representations, and therefore the Parliament could potentially limit how the voice is operating. I'm not totally sure that I agree with him, and that seems to contradict what other constitutional law professors like Nicholas Aroni have suggested, but I will come back to that. On the other hand, some other Yes advocates have suggested the voice is powerful, and that is entirely the point. For example, it has been suggested that mere symbolic recognition would be anachronistic and outdated, and therefore we need the voice referendum because mere symbolic recognition would not be sufficient, which would imply the voice has some degree of power. Megan Davis and George Williams have suggested that the voice is a structural reform and that it would redistribute power within the Commonwealth via the Constitution, which again would imply that the voice has some degree of power. And it then overall begs the question of what exactly is going on. How powerful is the voice? Is the voice modest and advisory? Or does the voice have some form of implicit power that it might be able to use to perhaps influence the government? So let's look into this. And if you've ever got any thoughts about the voice's powers, well, let me know that in the comments below. Now, to my mind, the voice would have significant power for several reasons. Now, the voice under this referendum would have the power to make representations to the Parliament and the executive government. The executive government being bodies like the RBA, educational bodies, various things like that. The Parliament would be empowered to make laws with respect to the voice, its representations, the manner thereof, and the like. Now, this leads to powers for actually a few reasons, and I'm largely paraphrasing these from articles that people like Nicholas Aroni have put out. Nicholas Aroni is a constitutional law professor at the University of Queensland. He's put out a couple of really detailed articles on these. I would encourage you to go and read those. But in any case, I see several areas in which the voice would have power. The first major one derives from the fact that the government would be required to consider its representations. Under ordinary doctrines of administrative law, the government must consider all relevant matters and must not consider irrelevant matters. As a result of this referendum, it would appear that the voice's representations are deemed to be relevant. A function of the fact that the referendum has passed would be that its representations are to be considered by the government that is making a decision. This is standard under administrative law. And similarly, under administrative law, if the voice feels like its representations were not considered, it could litigate. It could litigate saying that a relevant matter was not considered by the government when it was making a decision. This would be the case even if the representation were perhaps not very good or simply tangential, or the government decided to go in a different way for other valid reasons. Now, considering relevant matters is not inherently bad. If a matter is relevant and informative, it is good that the government considers it. However, the problem arises when one party is given the opportunity to make representations, because effectively it has that right under the Constitution, but other parties are not given that same opportunity or that same funding, and this therefore would create an unlevel playing field. This would be analogous to only being compelled to listen to one side of a court case and only funding one side of a court case. So in a concrete example, say we're to get a federal version of the cultural heritage laws that went through in Western Australia. Well, in that circumstance, the government would be compelled to consider the voices' representations. However, there would be no such compulsion to consider those of farmers or miners or various other groups. Now, those groups might be able to amass a lobby group, but they would need to privately fund it, and they would need to effectively campaign to get in front of the government. By contrast, the voice would automatically be able to go in front of the government. Now, that is just one example. The cultural heritage laws are legislative to begin with, but of course there would be an administrator overseeing those. The voice would be able to make representations to both the government legislating and to the administrator running the cultural heritage laws. So it can create an unlevel playing field, which is a problem. There is also the issue that perhaps vexatious litigation could be used in this context. So there's a fear that if you've got people like Thomas Mayo who are sitting on the voice, who are particularly wanting to bring about treaty and the like, well, he might use litigation in other extraneous contexts, tangential contexts, as a cudgel through which to compel the government to consider treaty.
The power in the voice campaign for that and punish politicians that ignore our advice. That is where the power comes from.
So say, for example, the voice wants to bring about a treaty, but the government does not want a treaty for various reasons. Well, in that case, the voice could hypothetically threaten to use vexatious litigation unless and until the government comes to the table, in which case the litigation and the courts could be used as a tool through which to bring about some other extraneous negotiation with the government. That's a fear, and it could make decision-making worse overall. Now, to be very clear, this is a function of standard administrative law. It's not scaremongering, it's not a scare campaign, it's simply what could be done under ordinary legal principles when someone's considerations are automatically deemed to be relevant considerations. Second, the government might be compelled to actually consult the voice before making decisions. And if the government doesn't go and consult the voice proactively, it could potentially be restrained from doing some actions. A right to make representations under the voice referendum would seemingly imply a practical opportunity to make those representations. This follows from various federal court and high court decisions, for example, most recently, the federal court's decision in the Woodside case, where Woodside was prevented from engaging in some actions because it had failed to consult with the relevant body. Now, that was a private entity, but the same logic applies at the government level. The logic here is portable, and as a result, one could see a situation where the voice could allege it was not given an appropriate or a sufficient opportunity to consider a matter. It was not consulted in the appropriate manner, and could sue to try to restrain government action. Now again, this might be legitimate or it might be illegitimate. It could be used vexatiously, it could be used to simply slow down government action if the government is doing something that the voice body does not like, but is doing so even after having actually considered some of the representations. It is something that can be used as a tool to compel government action. The important point here is that no other entity has a constitutionally enshrined right to be able to force the government to listen to its representations and to be consulted in this manner, which gives the voice significantly more power via access and representation rights than any other entity. Third, it has been asserted that the voice might expand the Parliament's legislative powers. This has been asserted by Nicholas Aroni in a couple of articles. Now, the basic logic behind this is that the amendment would empower the Parliament to make laws with respect to the voice, which could potentially include its representations. So if the voice were to make a representation on something like criminal justice, which had traditionally been within the state's remit, this could then empower the federal government to make laws in that area, make laws in relation to state-level criminal justice aspects, make laws in respect to state-level educational things, make laws in respect to what the states are otherwise doing. The voice, therefore, could potentially expand the federal government's legislative power. This is not necessarily desirable, because here you have a voice that is representing a portion of the population, expanding the federal government's power in a manner that could encompass all of the population. It creates a bit of a weird power dynamic. It creates a power dynamic where a small portion of the population, potentially a fraction of the population being those on the voice body, could then bring about expanding the Parliament's powers. Now, of course, a court might decide that this is not what's going to happen. A court might disagree with this interpretation. It's something that remains to be seen if or when the voice body actually exists. What is clear, however, is that the government failed to seal this up and failed to deal with this proactively when they were designing the voice. The government failed to bring in safeguards to prevent this from occurring. And the government's loose terminology in the voice referendum, the fact that it was not tightened up, is definitely laying at the government's feet. Now, there are some reasons to actually think that the Parliament would have this power. It has, for example, been reported that Parliament's ability to make laws, quote, with respect to the voice, was a last-minute addition and change to the referendum text, or to the amendment text. Before this, it didn't have that language. The fact that the government decided to change the words at the last minute might evince an intention to give such power to the voice. However, again, that would need to be litigated, and is not certain exactly how that would fall. Fourth, the voice alone has the constitutionally enshrined access and representation rights, and, to use Marshall Langton's terminology, it would not be disbanded. Now, it would implicitly also receive government funding. Now, there are, of course, some other organizations that are private sector organizations that can lobby the government, but like I said, they're private sector organizations, they need to raise their own money, they don't have constitutionally enshrined rights, they don't necessarily have access to the government, they're definitely not in the same position as the voice would be. They're certainly not on a level playing field with the voice, because like I've said, they're external bodies with no constitutionally enshrined right to make representations, not necessarily taxpayer funding, not necessarily any access to the government. Therefore, any analogy between the voice and external lobby groups is simply a false analogy. The two are not in any way really comparable. Fifth, the government's ability to limit the scope and remit of the voice is debatable. Now, Kenneth French has argued that maybe that might be the case. However, prominent legal scholars have suggested the voice would be able to talk to multiple government bodies, and that is the point. For example, that derives from an article by Megan Davis and Gabrielle Appleby, who are both law professors. Furthermore, it's been argued that limiting the scope of the voice would be rather difficult. And again, this is reported from comments that George Williams and Anne Twomey, who again are constitutional law professors, have suggested. Therefore, it is unlikely that the Parliament would really be able to limit the scope of the voice in a meaningful manner. Now, certainly the Parliament might be able to make some limits, but the ability to make limits, well, that would need to be litigated. It's not clear how much of a limit they would actually be able to impose constitutionally, because the Parliament sits under the Constitution. The Parliament cannot make unconstitutional laws. If the Constitution says the voice can do X, the Parliament can't say it can only do half X. If the Constitution says that the voice's remit is all matters that impact Indigenous Australians, the Parliament can't turn around and say that the voice's remit is only on matters in relation to Indigenous education or Indigenous health. The Parliament simply does not have that power. Now, for all of these reasons, to me it looks like the voice would actually have power and would not be merely advisory. Now, perhaps Parliament will be able to find a way to limit or curtail the voice. That remains to be seen. That, however, is likely to be litigated if the Parliament were to try to do so. At the moment, we appear to have competing experts, all expressing different views about how powerful or not the voice is going to be. It's up to you about whether or not you want to take that risk of the competing experts at the moment, how powerful you think the voice is going to be, and whether or not you think that is a good thing. What is clear at the moment, however, is we're getting mixed messages from the yes side of the campaign. It appears the voice would have some real power, but there is a debate about exactly what that power is going to be, what form it is going to be, and how large the powers are going to be. And in the case, that's what seems to be the case with the voice's powers. If you have any thoughts about it, let me know that in the comments below. I'd be interested to hear how powerful you think the voice is going to be in the end.